Hello, gentlemen, and welcome to another Pallavi Market Research video. Today, we're going to be discussing one of the most requested topics on this channel and in this community. And this has to do with the use of leverage and margin calls. Now, I've been hesitant to make this video for obvious reasons. Leverage is a dangerous, dangerous game, especially if you do not understand it in first principles, what it is you're actually doing. So I'm going to do my best to describe to you what leverage is and to, from a very practical perspective, and then, from a more philosophical perspective. All right. So if you stick around to the end of this video, you will have a great sense for how to utilize leverage and margin in not only your trading, but your entrepreneurship and maybe even your life. Okay. So first, if we're going to understand margin calls, we have to understand what leverage is. And leverage is a term from the world of physics that is utilized or leveraged in finance. And in physics, there are three different classes of leverage. There's a class three, which is essentially where you have a load right at the top of your hand, kind of like a bicep curl, right? Where the load is at the most, where the load is at the heaviest point. So this is like the least optimized form of leverage, right? Versus with a wheelbarrow, right? It's your load is distributed between the fulcrum and where you are actually adding the force. You see how force is here versus here with class three, right? The bicep is what's doing the work, the fulcrum is the shoulder, and the load is in the hand. Whereas with a wheelbarrow, you have the fulcrum at the wheel, you have the load in between the force and the fulcrum, right? This is where all the weight is. So the load is the weight. And then when you come to class one, this is where real leverage is unlocked. This is where the load is on the far side of the fulcrum and force is applied on the far side of the fulcrum, right? So this is like a claw hammer, right? Or a pair of pliers. That's why you're able to, with not so much energy, grab something with those pliers and have a ton of force going down in between whatever's in between the pliers, right? So what we want to understand is we want to understand we want to become really aware of our force, load, and fulcrum positions, right? Stay with me. So, everything when it comes to leverage in the world of finance refers to class one, okay? The use of a force to essentially alleviate the load or the force needed to lift the load. So, a really, really simple way to think about this is how we kill things, essentially. How we have hunted throughout time and even our socialization as human beings. So if you don't know, we come from a primate ancestor. And you and I, before we became these social beings, we lived in the trees. And what happened when we were pushed out of the trees when, there's like deforestation from natural phenomena, not obviously humans cutting shit down. At one point, our primate ancestors were forced out of the trees, the canopies, and forced into grasslands, right? And we quickly learned that if we were able to throw rocks at animals in groups, then what happens? The animals go away. Like if a saber-tooth tiger is coming at you, right? And you're one dude throwing a rock at it, okay? It's not going to do much. But if you and your 20 other best friends are sitting there throwing rocks at the saber-tooth tiger, you're going to be okay. That is literally how we socialize as human beings, just so you know. And that is our first discovery of leverage. This rock is a projectile. This rock is a tool. But really, the discovery of a tool is actually the discovery of leverage. Okay, it's the same phenomenon. So, and that's also why you look up to Steph Curry, Tom Brady, all these people. Think about the best sports athletes, right? They're really good at throwing things, guys. Throwing the football, throwing a basketball into an accurate location. That's why you bond with your dad when you play catch. It's because we literally became social creatures from throwing rocks. That is how key and how fundamental the use of leverage is to being a human being. So with time, these projectiles evolved into becoming a spear right? A spear was an evolution of just a stone you throw, right? And then from there, it became a spear with a bow, right? This is leverage, guys. And then a bow and arrow became obviously a musket or gun, right? And these are all the same forces of leverage, right? The bullet, the projectile, the arrow is the load. The force is the bow, the arm, or the actual gunpowder, the firing mechanism in the gun. And the fulcrum is, all the components in between, right? It's where you're placing the arrow. It's where it's the hand that you're throwing the rock in, right? It's all these things, okay? Now, how does this relate back to margin, right? So what is margin? What is the use of margin in trading more specifically? And if you haven't seen this movie, Margin Call, I highly recommend it. It's really pretty good, especially this character here. He's got some awesome monologues. And you probably this is like one of those movies where you can just watch the best scenes on YouTube for free and leave it at that. Now, we're back at our example of leverage. When you're utilizing leverage and margin when trading, you are essentially you're essentially depositing $1,000 and utilizing more money than you have, right? So what does that mean? It means you get to borrow money to trade with. That's really all that's happening. And there are different leverage ratios. So this is an example of a 10-to-1 ratio where you essentially deposit $1,000, you would collateralize that $1,000, meaning that if you were to whatever the margin requirements are to that leverage that you're being unlocked by the brokerage that you're working with, then you can lose that $1,000 principal, that equity, if your margin goes down. So what does margin going down look like? So these are another visualization. So we have your value. So to say this is like the $2,000, right? $2,500. And then you get another $2,500, and that's the stockbroker's investment in you. That's like basically them giving you a loan to make more money with, right? And they charge you some kind of interest on it, maybe or maybe not. And so, say the investment value goes up, you keep the winnings, guys. And this is the power of debt. This is what people don't understand with debt is like if I'm able to lend money, if I'm able to borrow money and make more money, right? I keep the equity that I create, right? So you keep all of this, but you still owe this, right? So you use this amount of money, borrow this much, and then you were able to make this much in the process, right? Whereas if the price goes down by a certain percentage, then your collateral is at risk. So if we move over to this example, it's essentially visualizing the same thing, right? But with different levels of margin. So like a healthy margin would be like borrowing, 50% or less of your collateralized amount. So if I have that $5,000 in equity, $2,500 of like collateralizing half of the total amount I'm using would be more intelligent than say in the previous example, if I'm borrowing $1,000, if I'm depositing $1,000 of equity and asking for $10,000 in return, then you're absolutely collateralizing the full $1,000, right? You're at risk of losing all of that money. So this is another way of looking at it. So a lot of times, most brokerages will play with this 30% margin maintenance level. So say you have, say you deposited $10,000, right? And you want to, and you borrow another $10,000. So you have $20,000 of worth of capital that you're trading with now. If your account falls under 30% of that aggregate value, if the equity goes down less than 30, so if it's now like $3,000, right? If like if you liquidated all the way down, then you're going to lose that $3,000, that last final $3,000. Okay. So these are more visualizations. Okay. So we have 100% margin here. So this is another visualization of what I was saying. So you have $10,000 deposited, then you get $10,000 here, and then you get a gain and you keep that gain, but you still owe that $10,000. So you have $15,000 in equity. And so what a lot of people will do is that they'll actually just ask. So once they get that gain, right? And this is where people really fuck up. They get the gain. So they start off with $10,000, then they basically borrow $10,000 and collateralize their $10,000 for another $10,000, and they have $20,000 to trade with. Then they make $5,000, and that's their equity that they contribute that to the equity, right? And then what people do is then they'll borrow another $5,000, right? And then they'll just continue this scheme. And then and then they might have $100,000 in here, but then there's a margin call and they lose it all. Okay. So these are the ways to cover your margin, right? So this is actually really helpful. So say you have this loss, right? This is what this loss is showing. And now your equity is getting really low. It's getting close to that 30% that we were talking about in the previous slide. You need to cover your margin. So that's like cover is another term for like literally covering your losses. It's for protecting yourself from liquidation. So there are different ways of doing that. You can either add to your equity, right? So you either like, you either just put more money into the equity or you increase the percentage of the equity relative to this, right? So you like, you trade and lend against it. Okay. So how do we utilize leverage in entrepreneurship? How do we utilize leverage in our day-to-day lives? So one amazing example of leverage is, from Elon Musk and Tesla in the early days of Tesla. So Tesla was started um, by not Elon Musk, actually. It was started by these guys who created Tesla Motors, and Elon Musk came in and he bought a majority stake in their company. But the company was just an idea. There was nothing going on. There was no car being built, nothing. So Elon Musk knew that if you want to make electric cars, you had to create a proof of concept. He had to create a roadster, which is essentially this is what's shown on the left, the first Tesla Roadster. But as you can see, he had to leverage other components from this Lotus vehicle to create this. And so you'll notice that the chassis, like the body, is very, very similar. And he actually, like, I don't know if this is true, but like you can see like these mirrors are the exact same. And there's a bunch of, little stylistic changes. And then there's some body panels here that I'm sure he flipped and made money on, where he's like, oh, well, I can sell this panel and, and then replace it with a cheaper panel and make, and continue reinvesting in the car, right? This is a great example of leverage where you're utilizing where you're trying to reinvent something, right? But you need to use the components that are available to you for leverage to leverage what you actually want to build in the future. So another way to think about this is like what innovation is in a practical sense. Innovation is just the reintegration of things that have already been invented. The car has already been invented, right? So Elon Musk isn't trying to invent a car, he's trying to re-engineer a car. So he doesn't need to invent the windshield wiper, he doesn't need to invent the body kit, he doesn't need to invent rims or tires and things like that. He can leverage the inventions from the past to contribute to his innovations of an innovation is I think it's a very optimistic word for what people actually do in the world. People just reintegrate and remix old ideas. Everyone's sitting on the shoulders of giants, right? And this is the perfect example with the Tesla. Tesla was a Lotus that got some batteries plugged into it, guys. You know what I mean? It's not like it's not like that revolutionary, really, when you really think about it, okay? The revolutionary shit is, the black budget government military projects. Okay. That's where real innovation's happening because they have infinite budgets to essentially build arms. So, gentlemen, that is today's video. I hope it was helpful. If you have any further questions about the use of leverage and margin in your trading world, let me know. I do not recommend any of you use leverage ever in liquid markets. We're going to make another video eventually, not probably anytime soon, discussing how to use debt and leverage in the context of illiquid markets, where that is, I think, a much more optimal strategy and is a lot more intelligent. And like a simple example of that, just so I can get that out here, is like buying a house. So if you buy a house, right, you have a loan against it. It's called a mortgage. When you get a mortgage, you are essentially you are co-investing in the house with a bank. The bank and you are in a joint venture buying this house. Okay. If the house price goes, if the value of the house starts at $250,000 and it goes to $500,000, right? You purchase the house with, say, like a 20% down payment, 30-year mortgage, right? Then you own 20% of the house at that $250,000 value, which is like what? $50,000. So you have $50,000 of equity in the house. But if the house goes up in value, another $250,000, then you have $300,000 of equity in the house because all of that ownership rights, those equity rights, go to you as the homeowner, right? Not the debt investor, not the lender. Do you understand? But and on the flip side of that, obviously, if you foreclose on the house, right, then the equity ownership rights goes to the bank, and that's where banks make money, right? Banks make money because they lend to you a home, you default on the loan, now they have ownership of a house. So they can take something that was a liability, right, with a loan, and they can flip it into an asset, and then because they then have equity rights over it, right? So, but that's now we're just talking. Now we're just talking. Have a great Sunday. Praise the Lord. We're gonna pick this up Monday. Consider subscribing to Palaview because tomorrow's report's gonna be fucking awesome. The 30th Palaview Premium Report. See you, gentlemen.